average adult takes between 20 and 30,000 breaths a day.
As a young man, you were struggling with mental health problems. Breathwork was the central pillar that allowed you to pull through.
Jamie Clements is a world-leading breathwork coach and founder of The Breath Space. He helps people overcome anxiety, burnout, and disconnection using conscious, connected breathing, functional breathing, and nervous system health. He has worked with top entrepreneurs, politicians, athletes, and organizations, and hosts the Human Nature podcast.
I don't believe anybody's born anxious, that you've been living in a prolonged chronic state of nervous system dysregulation. The people at the top of every game, whether it's athletes, whether it's business, are as focused and as effective in their output as they are in their rest. They take it as seriously, and that's why they're there. The number one comment that I've heard for the last 6 years of my career is,
I've already spoken with you for probably 10, 15 minutes, and I feel so calm. So if you want to feel calm for the next hour or so, stay with us. Walk me through some techniques of those 3 pillars.
For sure. So
Jamie, how would you describe your line of work?
I create spaces to support people in connecting back to themselves, connecting to balance and connecting to purpose in their lives.
Beautiful. And how do you do that?
The logistics of that, I suppose the how is a little bit more intricate. So my business operates across in-person and digital. So I have this kind of hybrid model for the business. The in-person is where you find the most depth. So that's retreats, in-person experiences, working with companies, working with people one-to-one. And then the digital is more the breadth. It's the accessibility. So I have my own app. I have online courses, online resources, and an online community to enable people to stay connected to their practice on an ongoing basis. And my goal and my intention is always to have those 2 worlds of the in-person and the digital speaking to each other and supporting each other. So if someone comes on a retreat, how do they integrate that experience? How do they take that experience home? So it's not just a singular portion of time where they escape from their reality and then come back to the same life and nothing's changed. So that for me is really the model and the way that I like to approach things. And I think breathwork links so beautifully across those 2 because there are so many different ways that we can tune in and tap into the breath to create change in our lives.
Why breathwork? What drew you to that practice?
Desperation.
Wow.
Is probably the one word answer. It depends how far back we go, but I studied economics at university. I had a graduate placement at Lloyd's Banking Group in corporate finance, moved into private banking. Then I moved into fintech and the world of startups. And just throughout that process, and even before that, in my late teens, through university and into my early career, I had a number of challenges with my mental health, with anxiety, with depression, with panic attacks. And those symptoms, what I kind of view as symptoms of a deeper underlying problem, just grew and got worse and got worse. And up until the age of about 24 was probably the lowest point that I found myself at in that sort of 9 or 10 year period. And it was at that point I was running a sales team at a startup, and I was just falling apart behind the scenes. And I was very closed-minded. I was very sort of typical man in his early 20s who, there was no sense of well-being, no sense of emotional expression, spirituality. All of these things that are such a core part of my life now just didn't exist, and I had no interest in. And at that point, found my way into therapy, then found my way into the world of sort of holistic health and wellness, started getting into yoga, into meditation. And it's just really this step-by-step process that happened very gradually, but also quite rapidly, that I see happen with a lot of people that I work with. We kind of go from 0 to 100 quite quickly, of having no interest in health and well-being. And then as soon as you start noticing, actually there's something here, like I feel different. And that for me led me to breathwork. And it was breathwork that really was the the central pillar. I would never say it was the only thing that made a difference, but it was the most significant thing that made a difference for me. So I went from having multiple panic attacks a day in my early 20s to not having had a panic attack in probably longer than 7 years now. Yeah, probably over 7 years.
That is fascinating. So as a young man, you were struggling with mental health problems. You did not understand what was the root cause that leads you into therapy and other wellness practices. But then breathwork was the central pillar that allowed you to pull through. I find that very interesting because most people would stay within therapy and then perhaps try different forms of therapy. Why breathwork was the most important or the most useful tool?
For sure. I think there are a few different reasons. I think the clearest reason for me was, as I spoke to, as a young man, I think at that point in my life in particular, and where society was at as well in terms of the mental health conversation and kind of emotional expression, particularly for men, I actually found it really hard in therapy to open up, like to actually vocalize, understand and express my emotions, even in the therapy room. I found really challenging. And finding myself in a breathwork session where it was a group session, but it was eyes closed. It was everything was being processed and happening inside of me. And not only that, but the experience of the session connected me, it actually got me out of my head. You know, talk therapy is very much, it's an intellectually led practice. We're intellectualizing, thinking about, analyzing what's going on, what's happened in your past and what's happening in your present and where that might be coming from. Breathwork actually took me away from that, away from thought. I've always been someone who doesn't have a problem thinking. And so to really tune into what I was feeling, the physicality of my experience, my nervous system, the state of my body and my emotions through the physical lens actually gave me a chance to feel and then regulate what was happening rather than just trying to think about it and talk about it more. And it's not to say that therapy hasn't been helpful in my life. I think there are layers and different ways that we can support ourselves. Therapy is very much top down, mind first. Breathwork very much bottom up. We're working with the body. And I think for anybody, we need both. There'll be some that work better for some people than others, but I think the combination of the two is really powerful. But for me, breathwork was the thing that most obviously moved the dial.
From what you're saying, it seems to me that therapy can work very well for someone that wants to identify a logical solution to a problem. But for someone that by definition is an overthinker, then perhaps that may not be the most accurate tool, the most efficient one. And then breathwork, instead of applying more logic to it, is more emotions-based, understanding how you feel without describing that with words.
For sure. I think it's something I write about and talk about a lot in my work at the moment, which is not to discount the importance of therapy, but actually to look at, as a society, particularly in the Western world, we are very intellectually led. We can talk about everything. We can analyze everything. And it's very easy to confuse, given the nature of the mind and how the brain works, understanding something with having actually processed something. We can get into this trap where we have analyzed and articulated how we feel, but we haven't allowed ourselves to feel it. And that's a very physical, somatic experience rather than an intellectual one. I think therapy and the whole personal development world has made everybody incredibly emotionally intelligent. We can talk about our feelings, but feelings aren't thought-led. They're very much a physical experience. And so if we're just spending more time talking about them, that's not actually always helping us process them. And if we're too quick to jump to the intellectualization of our feelings, we can actually bypass and skip just sitting with the feelings and actually feeling into what that experience is and giving space to those feelings. So much of my challenges in my sort of late teens and early 20s came from a place of pushing my feelings down unconsciously. But actually now what I see in a lot of people that I work with is that we're doing that in a different way. We're still avoiding feeling the feelings, but the way we're doing that is by intellectualizing them.
Compensating with logic.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I have an example that I think might be accurate to portray this, but let me know if this is precise. When we go through breakup, a very logical based person, even without going to therapy, may be able to understand that for a number of reasons, a number of factors, this relationship is not moving forward, and hence I need to move on with my life. 2 + 2 = 4, and that's it. And I'm not going to think about it anymore. I'm going to move on into the next chapter of my life. So that's a very logical approach to a breakup. But then perhaps if we're moving on too quickly, and I think time is an important ingredient in this recipe, we are suppressing our feelings. We are not confronting them. We're not digesting them. We're not processing them, as you're mentioning. And then perhaps down the line, this will come back to us as some sort of unresolved problem. Is this accurate?
I would say so, for sure. Yeah, I think it's always interesting. I don't know if you've heard the same, but there's, I guess, this generalization in breakups that it always seems that in the immediate aftermath of a breakup, men seem okay. Like men are fine, but then maybe a few months down the line, it hits them. Whereas for women, it seems to be they feel it heavy and hard straight after the breakup, but then move on beyond that. And, you know, there are differences between men and women, and that's a big, broad generalization.
Yeah.
But I do think, even if we take gender out of that example, people who rationalize and intellectualize the reasons and almost jump ahead to find the lesson in it. You know, what can I learn from this?
Yeah.
Well, you know, whether it's business, whether it's a relationship, you're going, where's the lesson in this? What can I be grateful for from this painful experience? And that's a really valuable thing. To find meaning in pain and suffering is valuable. It's you know, important, but not at the cost of actually feeling the experience and allowing yourself to go, that really feels heavy, like that's sad, I'm grieving, or I'm angry, or whatever the emotion is. And once you've actually allowed yourself to feel that, which is uncomfortable, and that's probably the reason that we jump to the thoughts, because that's, you know, if we can control or have the illusion of control, I can rationalize this and put it in a box. But actually, we have to feel it first before we can find the meaning in it. Otherwise, we're pushing it down in a more, you know, it's a societally accepted way of pushing our emotions down. You know, we'll always comment if someone is, you know, pushing their emotions down and just not allowing themselves to express anything at all. Like, we will encourage people not to do that, but it's quite a crafty way through intellectualizing it and just being able to explain it, which I think talk therapy, when not applied effectively, compounds the problem, because people just talk, and there's not as much space to really just sit in the feelings and be comfortable or be with that experience fully.
It seems to me that the end goal is still very important, but when we reach the timing of when we reach that end goal is also very important. The lesson learned is the stage in which we all want to be in. But I think, as you were mentioning, and this is my assumption, if we jump into that stage, the lesson learned stage, too quickly, that lesson learned is going to be very simple, perhaps not complete. It will not give you the overall picture. So it's not really a lesson learned. You could have learned so much more. But if you sit with your feelings and with your emotions for a bit longer, that will make the lesson learned so much more complete and complex. That will make you a better version of yourself to confront a similar situation in the future.
Absolutely. Because I think if we're pushing, you know, even if it's conscious or unconscious, if we are denying ourselves the feeling and the right to feel the feeling, that will, as you spoke to earlier, come back around in another form. Yeah. So even if you've intellectualized and understood the experience and taken the lesson from it, it's the processing of the feeling that allows you to integrate that lesson. Because if the lesson's there, but the feeling hasn't been met and held, then you're going to repeat that cycle. You're going to repeat that pattern, that experience again. And so I think just that, again, it's this marrying of the body and the mind, of the ego and the self, where both exist. The feelings and the thoughts both exist, and it's not to say one is right and one is wrong. It's just about how can we integrate the two, and remove this idea of separation between the two, but then think and feel into the process that we follow, of giving yourself space to actually feel the thing, regardless of how uncomfortable it is. And then we can think about, what does that mean? What can I take from this?
It also seems to me like therapy is a good tool to bring you awareness around a problem in your environment, and have awareness and make an assessment on where do you fall within that problem, and what are the external factors, and have a good, let's say, general understanding. But if I compare that to what you're saying with breathwork, it seems that breathwork is more an inner understanding of yourself. So it's more of a purely related personal growth. What can I learn of who I am? Which I think it's profoundly valuable.
Absolutely. I think we're very quick again in the modern personal development space to externalize the responsibility for our well-being. We're looking to influencers, we're looking to therapists, we're looking to external people to tell us how to live our lives. We outsource our agency. And I personally view agency as one of the core factors to well-being. So are you living life on your own terms? And I think breath as a singular tool in all its different forms returns sovereignty to the individual in a way that not many other things do, because all of a sudden you are able to both connect yourself, but then also regulate yourself through something that is uniquely yours, through going inwards rather than going outwards and going, what do I do? Tell me what to do. And I think that's a really powerful tool, even at the level of something like confidence, to actually know that you can hold yourself through stress, through strain, through discomfort, through the natural ups and downs of life, and have a tool through which to support yourself in that is incredibly powerful.
Is it a tool for meditation then?
We were talking about this actually before we sat down. I always describe meditation and breathwork as cousins. They're like not twins. They're not that closely related, but they are in the same family. For me, breathwork in the modern world, the modern Western world particularly, is a fantastic support to help someone move towards a deeper state of meditation. The reason for that being that for many people who find themselves stressed, anxious, overwhelmed, burnt out, dysregulated within their nervous system, to ask them or invite them to sit still and meditate for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Most people I know can't do that straight away. And that's a sign of where we're at as a society and the pace at which things move and the stress that people are under. Breathwork, because it is more of a direct tool and a direct input into the state of your nervous system, it really can directly influence your state. We can use the breath to drop somebody into a more grounded state that then makes that stillness of meditation more comfortable, more accessible. And so I think they can work really closely together. I think for the world in which we live, breathwork and the rise in popularity that we've seen in breathwork, I think in a large part is down to this. It's more accessible, it gives people something to do, and it directly influences the state of the nervous system and the stress response.
What did you study or practice to become an expert in this field?
Yeah, so the world of breathwork training and certifications is it's a bit of a wild west at times. There's a lot out there. It's a relatively unregulated space, which creates some challenges and some things that I'm kind of looking into at the moment within the industry to see how we can do things better. For me, I've done 4 separate qualifications. I started training in sort of respiratory physiology and breathwork for nervous system regulation with a company called XPT. I then trained in performance breathwork with a company called the Oxygen Advantage. I then did a 12-month therapeutic breathwork mentorship with Breath Guru, and then most recently did a 6-month breath science certification with Performance Through Health. So for me, I've kind of put those puzzle pieces together. They all serve slightly different purposes. Some of them are more spiritually led, more emotionally led. Some of them are more science-based and respiratory physiology-based. Just for me I've always wanted to be a master generalist within the world of breathwork. You can specialize, amazing friends of mine who are specialists in, peak performance and working with athletes. Friends of mine who are amazing from more of a therapeutic lens. For me, I always wanted to be able to maintain a level of breadth across everything within the space.
What would you say to our audience right now? Because they may be deciding if they want to stay with you and I a bit longer for the next hour or so and finish the episode. So what would you tell them? Why should they listen to you in the next hour?
That's a good question. I appreciate my natural bias given my space in the world, but in my opinion and through what I've seen in my work, breathwork provides a singular, complete framework to address so many of the challenges that people in modern society are facing. And the three core ones that I always pull out that I feel I address in my work are disconnection from self, dysregulation of the nervous system in the form of stress, anxiety, burnout, and actually connection to meaning and purpose. And I think those three collectively take people from feeling stuck, lost, overwhelmed to actually genuinely finding fulfillment and meaning in their lives. And the final piece that I would add on to that is the number one comment that I've heard for the last 6 years of my career is it's just breathing. How much could it possibly give me? And I suppose for anyone wondering if they're going to stick around, I would say that there's a lot more to it than most people realize. And that's something that continues to blow my mind. The more that I learn, the deeper that I go into the research and into this world, I think there's so much that we are yet to understand. And there's one study that I always come back to and cite for anyone who is on the fence about breathwork, which came out about 18 months ago. It was a particular study that found that something called conscious connected breathing, which is one of these deeper therapeutic modalities of breathwork, can create mystical and altered states of consciousness on par with medium to high doses of psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms. And so everyone's interested in psychedelics, but we can create psychedelic states and psychedelic experiences through breathwork. And so if you want to understand more about that, then stick around.
On top of all the educational content that you will be sharing and that people would hopefully be able to implement into their daily lives to feel more connected, unwind, and release stress. I've already spoken with you for probably 10, 15 minutes, and I feel so calm. So if at least you want to feel calm for the next hour or so, stay with us. Imagine I'm a 10-year-old. How would you describe breathwork in the wellness context to me?
I'm fortunate to have had some experience of working with children, so this should be doable. The simplest thing that I try to support everybody on understanding is the role of the breath within how we think, feel, and operate in the world. Your breath has the power to change the state of a child's not going to understand the nervous system, but the state of your nervous system. Your nervous system, at a very simple level, is the lens through which you experience the world around you. And what I mean by that is that if your nervous system is in a state of activation and stress, the room that you're in, wherever you are, is going to feel dangerous. You're going to feel on edge. When you're anxious, someone could drop a fork in a restaurant and you jump. That's your nervous system lens. You could be in the same restaurant and your nervous system's in a calm, balanced, regulated state. Exactly the same thing happens. Loud noise, someone drops a fork, drops a plate. Doesn't even register. You go, oh, what was that? That is the expression of your nervous system, is the lens through which you're experiencing the world around you. Your breath is the single most accessible and powerful tool to shift the state of your nervous system. So to go from jumpy, anxious, overwhelmed, to calm, balanced, regulated, your breath is a remote control for the state of your nervous system if you understand how to use it and how to shift it in order to create certain changes. And we can create a number of different changes based on how we influence and change the breath.
So it seems to me that it's more of a reactive tool rather than proactive.
That's a very good point. It can be both. It can be both. I think the popularity of breathwork has come through it being seen as a reactive tool. You know, if you're feeling really anxious, this was my entry point. Feel you're really anxious, or maybe you feel like a panic attack's coming on. Slow your breath down, extend your exhale. How can you breathe to create calm? Very, very important, very, very effective. The evolution of that, both for me and in people that I work with, is actually, how do I take myself, if my level of stress is at a 7 out of 10 as my baseline, how do I actually move myself day to day from a baseline of 7 to a baseline of 5, a baseline of 4? How do I bring down my overall level of activation and balance within the nervous system? And that's where the proactive side of the practice comes in. That's where I encourage people to build a daily practice, where it's, regardless of how you're feeling, what is your daily practice of working with your breath to bring that level of energy, of activation, of stress within your system down to a lower level hum? Because so many people that I work with, and I'm sure people that you know in your life, the number of times I've heard, I'm just an anxious person. I don't believe anybody's born anxious. We have our wiring, we have our, if we want to go into the generational trauma, if we want to go into all of that, there are people who will have things inbuilt into them that might make them more susceptible to anxiety. But I don't believe anybody is an anxious person. And so that typically to me just means that you've been living in a prolonged chronic state of nervous system dysregulation, of overstress, overwork, moving too quickly. The world doesn't help with that right now because of the pace of everything. But we do have tools like the breath that can bring down that level of activation in the system and move someone out of this identification with being just anxious to actually going, oh, my life and my experience of the world around me has shifted day to day. And that's where the proactive practice comes in.
Then breath work has the ability to influence and impact our neurochemicals. Because if breath work can decrease our stress baseline, then it has the ability to decrease our cortisol levels, which are the stress hormone, which is the stress hormone. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say in terms of neurochemicals, the cortisol is probably the one that I would speak about more than any other, just because of that relation between breath and stress. For many of us, we don't understand the cortisol cycle that happens throughout the day. We get this peak of cortisol in the morning that actually wakes us up, then rises into sort of early afternoon, starts to drop, and then drops to a point where we start feeling tired and we want to fall asleep. Overstress, burnout, dysregulation throws that cycle off, where our cortisol baseline doesn't actually drop to where it needs to be for sleep, which is where things like insomnia start to kick in. It's also why a lot of people that I work with find themselves waking up in the middle of the night, because if your cortisol doesn't drop to where it needs to for sleep, you might be able to fall asleep because you're just exhausted. But as soon as it starts to rise again, as it naturally does, it'll wake you up before you want or need to wake up. And so that's where we start to see the impact of stress feeding into cortisol, feeding into insomnia, feeding into poor sleep, feeding into stress, and it creates this vicious cycle. So I'd say, yeah, as far as neurochemicals go, cortisol is the one that we are going to see probably the most significant impact on as far as breathwork is concerned.
Is there a spiritual side to breathwork too, or is it only science-based?
Absolutely both. Yeah, for me, the way that I always, I suppose, lay out breathwork is breathwork being a real, I suppose, a catch-all, an umbrella term that covers a lot of ground. It's any way that we can use our breath to shift our state physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Within that, there are really three core pillars. The first is functional breathing, which is about how you breathe day to day. What's your natural breathing pattern and how that's supporting you or not. Nervous system regulation, which we've talked a lot about. How can you use the breath and simple breathing techniques to create a change in your state? And then we have the more therapeutic, spiritually led, emotionally led kind of exploratory practices of breath work, like the one I mentioned with that study that can create these psychedelic type experiences. That for me is where we really start to get into the realms of spirituality. Spirituality used to be a very loaded term for me. I thought it was very woo-woo, very kind of mystical, a bit, too far out there for me, who was very logical and very kind of science-led at the time to connect to. But as I've gone deeper into this work and as I connected to my own practice more, and particularly these deeper practices, it inevitably connects you to a sense of spirituality. And I think breath is at the core of every major religion, spiritual tradition. They are all uniquely connected to the breath and incredibly connected to the breath as this life force. And there's a teacher of mine who once shared, the breath really is this gateway between our finite selves, us as an individual, and everything that's around us. As he said, as the universe exhales, you inhale, and as you exhale, the universe inhales. It's this constant flow, right, of this exchange between us and the world around us. And the more we connect to the breath, the more we connect to ourselves. And paradoxically, the more we connect to ourselves, the more we connect to each other, but also the natural world and everything around us.
3 pillars. It seems to me that the first pillar, it is a proactive approach. How can we improve the way in which we breathe every day? And pillar number 2 is more reactive. There is a problem, there is a stressor that is affecting us. What are the different breathing techniques that will help us cope with that? And then the third one, which, it does seem to be the more spiritual one, is the one that can maybe allow you to access different parts of your brain, different ideas, imagination, innovation. Before we deep dive into these 3 different pillars, and I would like for you to share with me some techniques for each pillar.
Sure.
Are there certain people that are more responsive to breathwork in general?
I would say it always depends, but the type of people that I see coming into my spaces, I would say they're all different, but they probably share some traits as well. I'd say they tend to be high performing in some capacity. That might be, as you spoke to earlier, it might be in work, it might be, in life, it might be in sport, it might be, just in the world in general, someone who holds themselves to quite high standards. They are what I would describe as curious, emotionally intelligent seekers. So people who maybe have been through therapy and really understand themselves on the intellectual level, but are still feeling like there's something more. They're asking the big questions. They're asking, what does this all mean? How can I move my life towards something that feels meaningful and fulfilling? And I would say a lot of type A's as well. So people that are driven, focused, ambitious. Those people also tend to be the ones who have the most to gain from these practices and get the most from them. Because if you're someone, I've worked also with a few people who are naturally pretty calm. They're pretty at peace. They're pretty at ease. And what I would do with someone like that is different to what I would do with someone who's more type A, a little bit more tightly wound and highly strung and fast moving. I would say the world sits more on that side in general now of those slightly more overstressed, overworked individuals. And I'd say for those people, they have the most to gain just in terms of the immediate impact of starting to slow their breath down, starting to work with their breath, starting to connect to their body, and the impact that can have in terms of stress, sleep, focus, balance. And really it just starts to almost immediately show up in their lives in a really impactful way.
Walk me through some techniques of those 3 pillars.
For sure. So pillar number 1, functional breathing. Average adult takes between 20 and 30,000 breaths a day. Average adult.
20 or 30,000?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the number is increasing the more stressed we become. But average adult between 20 and 30,000 breaths. The average adult most likely pays attention to 0 of those. But if we're doing something so fundamental over 20,000 times a day, it's probably pretty important to understand how you're doing it, how to do it in a way that's going to support you. If you're doing something 20,000 times a day in a way that isn't supporting you, that's going to have a significant negative impact over time. So, all that to say, the first step of functional breathing is breath awareness, starting to pay attention to the breath. The breath is so powerful because of its simplicity, but it's also the simplicity that means we take it for granted. That question that I've got so many times, it's just breathing. What could it possibly do for me? But because of that simplicity, it's incredibly important. And so what we want to be looking at with functional breathing is, how do I breathe day to day, moment to moment? How do I breathe at rest, during sleep, during exercise, as I answer emails? All of these moments in our day, how am I breathing? A lot of people, and this is something that came out in the press during lockdown, was a lot of people who hold their breath unconsciously while they're answering emails because they're stressed. A lot of people who at rest, just sat watching TV in the evening, are breathing fast and shallow and short into their chest, which is going to create stress. And so what we want to be aiming for with functional breathing is, firstly, becoming more connected to how you breathe day to day, by actually just identifying how do you breathe before you change anything. And then starting to move towards the foundational pillars of a healthy, more optimal breathing pattern, which is going to be breathing through the nose. It's going to be breathing expansively, so deeper and lower. It's going to be
both inhaling and exhaling through the nose.
Yes, at rest, that's how we want to be breathing, is in and out through the nose. We want to be breathing deeply and expansively into the lower portion of the lungs. We want to be breathing slowly, so lowering our respiratory rate. Lots of the wearables now, like the Whoop and the Oura Ring, have respiratory rate data, so you can see what your respiratory rate is, and we want that to be on the lower side. And then breathing gently. A lot of people think to deepen their breath, they have to take these big, aggressive, expansive breaths.
The respiratory rate, which does that mean that we need to be breathing longer but less?
Yes, so it would be less breaths per minute. And we want that also to be gentle. So we don't want to be taking, because that's creating strain on the nervous system. We want it to be virtually silent, but slow and gentle. If you were to sit with a monk, for example, you probably wouldn't hear him breathing. It would probably just be there. It would be flowing without him having to give it too much thought, and it'd be at a really slow rate. And so that's where, we're not monks, of course, but that's where we want to be moving towards, is just deeper breathing, slower breathing, more gentle breathing, and through the nose.
Should I feel the breathing on my stomach or on my chest?
Usually we'll feel a bit of both. Usually in the healthiest breathing patterns, it will move from the bottom up. So it'll start low at the bottom of the lungs, and then it will start to fill. The most important thing I think to understand from this perspective is that if you think about how you breathe when you're stressed or anxious or scared or panicking, it's very fast, it's very shallow. It's like really short breathing into the upper chest and the throat. If you are breathing that way unconsciously when you're watching TV or answering emails, that's sending signals of stress back through the nervous system. And so we're creating this vicious cycle of short, shallow breathing, stress, more shallow breathing, and it just continues until we interrupt it. And the breath is the most effective way to interrupt that cycle.
I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
So assuming the human body is not perfect, but let's say a pretty good machine. It always has a reaction to a given situation. For example, if we exercise, we are sweating, and that's something that is unconscious that our body is automatically doing because it's aiming to cool down your body. Now, let's say that I'm under stress because of an email or watching a movie because it's a horror movie. Maybe some cortisol gets released. Isn't our breathing, which maybe it's also automated, maybe the speed of our breathing increased because that's what the body needs naturally? Or is this a mistake, an error from our body?
not a mistake. And I think that's something I always try and stress to people, is that I don't want people to become stressed about how they're breathing, because that's just going to create more of the problem that we're trying to resolve. And so, yes, your body is intelligent. It's always trying to return to homeostasis.
Yeah, homeostasis.
The challenge, and what I think we're really saying the same thing here, is that your breath will fluctuate throughout the day with fluctuations in stress, fluctuations in environment. That will happen. It shouldn't always stay exactly the same. But the problem comes from the fact that the way that we are living our lives now is somewhat unnatural for us, in terms of the amount we're working, in terms of light exposure, in terms of time outside, all of these factors that are now well documented, right? In terms of how much we're moving, all of these different aspects. Because of that, what we're finding is that, it's a term I've used quite a few times, but the state of nervous system dysregulation, where is really at its core not about never being stressed. It's about natural fluctuations. So when stress shows up, we're stressed. Then we go back into rest. And we have this elasticity of the nervous system and this capacity of the nervous system to be on when it's required and then switch off again. On when it's required, switch off again. But because of how we're living our lives, most people wake up, jump out of bed, grab a coffee, we're straight into stress. We then start working and we stay up there and we stay up there. And then we try and switch off at the end of the day. Does it happen? For a lot of people, not in the way that they hope it would, which is where they get into challenges with sleep. So to come back to your point, yes, your breath will, when something stressful happens, shift in the way that it should, because that's your nervous system doing its job. The problem arises is when that stress is no longer around. The email's been dealt with, the difficult conversation's been had, the confrontation's been had, we're staying stuck. That for me is really my personal definition of nervous system dysregulation, is when we become chronically activated or chronically stuck in one state. That could be stress, that could be shut down, could show up in many different forms. But for most people, it's that overactivation of the stress response, because we're not getting enough proper rest. We're not slowing down enough. We're not dosing kind of activation and rest in a way that's supportive for us, because we're just trying to do too much and we're moving at too fast a pace. And so, yes, we'll see that fluctuation with the breath, but quite often we'll find people getting stuck where even when they are resting, their nervous system is still ticking over. So it's like the foot is staying on the gas even when it's no longer required.
That makes so much sense also, because let's say if we go back hundreds and hundreds of years, man sees a tiger, your amygdala releases cortisol for you to survive. And that obviously would also impact your breath. But in this day and age, there are no tigers, but there are so many more stressors. It's not only that email that you need to answer, or you're getting notifications on your phone, like you hear, if you live in a city like London, you hear the traffic outside. So you are supposed to be resting, but there are all these other stressors, these different factors that are constantly around you, will affect you and will keep your cortisol levels high when they shouldn't be. And then by default, also your breathing is going to be affected. Fascinating. So breathe in from your nose, breathe out from your nose, from your belly all the way until your lungs, slowly and gently.
Yeah. So that's really, if we think about, we can think about it as pillars, or we can think about it as a pyramid. That's really the base, right? That's the first layer of just pay more attention to your breath and not overthinking it, but just start to notice. I hear a lot of people saying to me, I just noticed even in this conversation that I'm having with you that I was holding my breath or I was breathing very shallow. And in those moments of noticing that, can you take a couple of slower breaths? Can you breathe through the nose? I think that is where the compound effect over time really builds up, is just that subtle awareness of the breath. I never want anyone to be trying to pay attention to every single breath they take. That would be exhausting and stressful and pointless, but actually just using the breath as a gateway into, how do I feel? If you ever want to know how you feel, go to your breath first. Are you breathing really shallow? Are you breathing really fast? Or are you actually breathing and holding yourself in a way that speaks to openness and calm? So it's also a great window into connecting to yourself, which is, the first starting point for any personal practice, any wellness practice.
Take me to that second pillar, because that one sounds incredibly interesting for so many occasions or use cases. You fight with your partner, or you're about to give a presentation at work. How can you bring yourself to homeostasis, to baseline, calm down?
For sure. So most fundamental understanding of this is thinking about two levers within the nervous system. We have our rest and digest response, the calming response within the nervous system, and then we have the mobilization and activation response within the nervous system. Both have value. We often hear most commonly talked about in my line of work, how do we move people into calm? Sure, lots of us are stressed, that's very important, but we can actually use that other lever to create energy when we need it. If we're feeling sluggish, if we're feeling lethargic, how do we actually turn things on and start the engine? A couple of use cases you mentioned there, confrontation or presentation, public speaking, whatever it might be. How do we then start to think about influencing and changing the speed of the breath, the depth of the breath, the ratio of inhale to exhale, maybe using breath holds? So really starting to get curious about how you can use your breath. But the beauty as well of the breath in this pillar, in this form, is that there are only so many things that you can change. You can change the inhale, the hold at the top of the breath, the exhale, the hold at the bottom of the breath. We've got 4 things, and then you can change the speed, the depth, and the ratio. That's really all we've got. But there are so many formulations, a bit like a passcode, right? If you've got 4 digits, you can change those things in a few different ways to create different changes. And so if we want to be moving down, so reducing the amount of energy in your system to create more calm, more balance, more peace, our focus here all of those things we just talked about with functional breathing, usually breathing through the nose, usually reducing your respiratory rate and breathing more deeply. What we can then start to layer in on top of that doesn't need to be complicated. Probably the most effective in my personal practice for alleviating stress and anxiety, very simple extended exhale breathing. Make your exhale longer than your inhale. On a physiological basis, when we do that, the heart slows down and your whole system settles. So
feel everything through the nose.
With that, I'm less fussy, because our goal is to create calm. And so the way that we're going to do that is to lengthen that exhale as comfortably, but as much as we can. For a lot of people who are new to these practices, the easiest way to do that is in through the nose and blowing the exhale out of the mouth, like you're blowing through a straw. So you can get towards something, a typical ratio might be 4-second inhale, 8-second exhale in the nose, out the mouth. But it could also just be in and out through the nose. What we do want to focus on, just from a health and functionality perspective, is usually inhaling through the nose. That's really important. We get that filtration that the nose gives us. It naturally slows the breath down. So extending the exhale is a great way to create calm within the system. We can also use, there's a couple of really popular techniques like 4-4-8 breathing. So in for 4, hold for 4, out for 8, 4-7-8 breathing, the same, in for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. Really, people often ask me about my own personal practice, and it's very, very simple, but it's simple because it doesn't have to be any more complicated than it needs to be. And once you know what you're doing and you know your own breath and your own nervous system, you can do 5 minutes of a single technique and see a significant change. And so for what we call down regulating the nervous system, extending the exhale, slowing the breathing down, and perhaps using some short holds after the inhale. So taking a breath in, holding, and then extending the exhale. If we shift then to the increase of energy within the nervous system, this would be for energy, focus, motivation, really charging you up if you needed a bit of a boost. Almost exactly the opposite. More inhale focused, quicker breathing, still deeper breathing, but bigger breaths, so more active breathing. Something like the Wim Hof method breathing is really effective, which is just actually in and out through the mouth, where people are breathing quite a quick tempo. And that is just introducing what we call hormetic stress, with positive stress, intentional stress, to create a desired response. So that is great if you're just feeling low energy, lethargic. The last technique within this realm that is really popular, and for good reason, is box breathing. So this was made famous by the Navy SEALs. So they use it on their way into a combat zone. So if you think combat zone, fortunately, we're not heading into any real combat zones, but public speaking, difficult conversation, big meeting, you're already on your way there before you even think about it, going to be feeling the adrenaline. You're going to be feeling the energy. What we don't want to do there is go too far in either direction. You don't want to feel sleepy and sluggish. You want to be on it. You want to be focused. You want to be motivated and concentrated. But if you start speeding your breath up and adding stress, you're going to be overstimulated. You're going to be jittery. You're going to be anxious. So how do we find that healthy middle ground? And that's where box breathing is really effective. So box breathing uses all 4 parts of the breath that we discussed: inhale, hold, exhale, hold, but an even ratio of all 4. Usually all through the nose. We would do 4 seconds in, 4-second hold, 4 seconds out, 4-second hold, repeat. And that is a great way just to find center, particularly in times of high stress. That for me is probably the one I use most frequently if I'm just trying to come back to center in the midst of something stressful and something challenging.
Wow, fascinating. I could just, hear you talk about this for hours and hours. I was thinking while you were saying this second pillar, 2 different moments in my life in which I very much realized that breath work was very important. Years ago, I still am under stress, but I guess I'm better at coping with it because I've learned. But years ago, I still had a lot of stress, but I wasn't as capable to cope with it. And I went through 2 panic attacks, different moments for different reasons. It's interesting because with panic attacks, you never know what's really triggering it, because it doesn't happen in the moment in which you are under severe stress. Maybe you're under stress for like a few weeks and then you come down for a week and then that's when it happens. But while it was harder to pinpoint what was the root cause for the panic attack, it was so easy to find a common denominator between both panic attacks, which was my breathing. It all started from a very unusual, very dynamic breathing. And I wonder if for anyone, because I do know that, for example, a good friend of my fiance, she has, and also good friends of mine, they have regular panic attacks. Mine, fortunately, there were 2 very specific cases, but these 2 other friends that I have, they go through regular panic attacks. Is there something that they could be doing within that moment so they can either have a shorter, milder panic attack or just maybe avoid it altogether?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Something I feel somewhat uniquely qualified to answer as well, from personal lived experience as well of panic attacks. So one thing I used to find incredibly frustrating when I was having panic attacks was someone just telling me to slow my breath down. There's so much advice out there in the world now. It's like, if you're having a panic attack, just breathe in for 4 and out for 10 and you'll be fine. It's like, having had them, both of us know it's not as simple as that. You can't just catch your breath again. Interesting study that came out a few years ago found that the first signs on a physiological level of a panic attack actually start up to 3 hours before the panic attack itself, which you never realize, right? You think it just happens, it's just in the moment, but it's that gradual build. Your bucket's just gradually filling up, but you only notice it as it starts to tip over. And so to come back to the question you actually asked a while back around proactive and reactive, both, again, the proactive piece for anyone who experiences regular panic attacks is actually getting into the habit of a daily practice outside of the panic attack, because panic attacks for me are symptomatic of that bucket being quite full quite a lot of the time, and it not taking a lot to then tip us into panic and overwhelm. And so how do we let some of the water out of that bucket? How do we release the valve and just take the edge off? That's the daily practice. So it might be 5 to 10 minutes, first thing, last thing throughout the day, of extended exhale breathing, box breathing, something that we've talked about just to slow things down. And that compounds over time from a proactive standpoint to move you away from the regularity of the panic attacks. I would also stress and emphasize there is a place in all of this for other modalities. It might be therapy to actually talk about why are they showing up? Can we understand the root cause a little bit better? It might be the more spiritually led end of the breathwork spectrum of actually going, how do we deep dive into, it might be underlying trauma, it might be past pain that is manifesting as panic attacks. But from a pure breathwork, right here, right now perspective, getting into that daily practice of slowing things down is incredibly effective and important. In the moment of panic attack or an experience of extreme anxiety, two options that work slightly differently for different people. The first would be using short, simple breath holds in the moment. So if you think, I'm not able to catch my breath and slow it down, but what I can do is hold the breath. It might be you hold the breath for 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and then you try and breathe more slowly. Wait a couple more seconds, hold again. And so just interrupting the rapid breathing that a panic attack can bring on can be really effective as a means of gradually slowing the breath down. For other people, they might feel more able to begin actually slowing their breathing down once they've caught it, rather than trying to jump to, in for 5, out for 10 or anything intense from that perspective, or particularly extreme in a shift. Something called ratio breathing, where you just gradually slow the breath down. So it might be in for 2, out for 2, or in for 2, hold for 2, out for 2, just to reduce your respiratory rate, your breathing rate, and slow things down. And then you might go to 3 seconds, then you might go to 4 seconds. This could be over a course of 5-10 minutes where you're just starting to gradually slow your breathing down. And a dual effect, I suppose, of the actual influence of that on your nervous system to hopefully support the panic attack in being less overwhelming and getting less out of hand, but also giving your mind something to focus on, a single point of focus, rather than what is often, the experience of anxiety and panic attacks, which is, spinning into overthinking, rumination, overwhelm. So just giving the mind a single point of focus as well, alongside the influence of the breath on the nervous system directly, is really effective.
Let's go for that third pillar.
Let's do it. So it can come under many different names, many different guises, but the way that I teach and what I work with is something called conscious connected breathing. This is a singular, circular pattern of breathing, actually breathing in and out of the mouth. So we use the mouth intentionally to create a shift in our blood biochemistry, in particular, lowering our blood carbon dioxide levels. It's not particularly important in terms of the physiology, but it's important because that lowering of blood carbon dioxide levels creates a cascade of physiological and psychological changes that open up this psychedelic therapeutic experience. Typically, this work is done either one-to-one between a facilitator and a participant, or I host regular group sessions and retreats where we might have between 10, 20, 30 people in a space breathing in that way together. You're breathing that way typically for between 30 and 90 minutes. And through that experience, laying down, breathing in this way, really going inwards, we start to see...
you breathe in the same way for the... How do you breathe?
So it'd be in and out through the mouth. It'd be focusing on breathing deeply again. And the mouth is open and you focus on quite a big breath in, and then you're connecting, removing the pause between inhale and exhale, and just a soft sigh out. So it's kind of like...
Isn't that hyperventilating?
In a form, yes. It's a choice to increase ventilation. So it's what we would call like a high ventilation breathwork practice, because I think often hyperventilation conjures up an image of uncontrolled. It's like, whereas high ventilation, we're just choosing to increase the depth and volume of the breath. When we do that over a prolonged period of time, we see these physical changes. So people will often get tingling and physical changes in the body as the energy starts to move, and we get these physiological changes. And then also we get this altered state of consciousness, this mystical experience, this psychedelic experience that can show up. What's going on under the surface there, from our best understanding, is we're creating a slightly hypoxic condition within the brain, so a low oxygen state within the brain. And similar, from what we understand, to something like psilocybin, we get this down regulation, this decrease in activity in the default mode network, which is sort of the egoic mind. It's the monkey mind, that seat of rumination. And we also see, as that happens, if we think about the egoic mind as a bit of a protection mechanism, it's very good at keeping us safe, but it can also be protecting us from things within our subconscious and unconscious that might be past pain, traumatic experiences, uncomfortable experiences that live within the unconscious that we might have repressed or suppressed. And so we can actually drop into this psychedelic type experience where unconscious material that our ego has been protecting us from can resurface. Now, why would we want that? Speaks to what we were discussing right at the beginning, which is if we are not giving ourselves space to feel our feelings and we're pushing them down, that can, a bit like whack-a-mole, pop up in the future as physical pain, mental and emotional pain, spiritual pain. And so as we allow this subconscious material to surface through choice and intention in a space that is curated for that purpose with a facilitator who knows how to hold that, you give yourself an opportunity to express things that have previously gone unexpressed. You allow yourself to process things that you might have pushed down, pushed away, not wanted to confront. And through that, giving ourselves an opportunity to let go of those things, to process those things, to integrate those things into the conscious mind, into the rational mind, and into our sort of wholeness. And so it can be an incredibly profound and impactful experience on a healing level, but also through those shifts on a psychological and a physiological level, people also get this connection to something larger than themselves, this spiritual aspect of the experience, where as the egoic mind gets quieter, we feel this dissolution and this sort of dissolving into oneness that a lot of people experience with psychedelics. A lot of people experience in, peak experiences with nature, for example, even something like, watching a beautiful sunset. When we feel that sense of awe and wonder, we feel very connected to everything that's going on around us in the universe. And similarly, when we work with the breath in this way and drop into this non-ordinary state of consciousness, people experience this dissolution of the sense of separation between themselves, others, and the world around them, whilst also having space to connect to and process that unconscious material that might surface through the experience.
It sounds like a life-changing experience. How often should we do that? Should we do it once in our life?
It can be, it was a huge part of my personal journey with breathwork, and it really did move the dial significantly for me. And I would say it's been life-changing. In terms of frequency, it's interesting, right? Compared to something like psychedelics, for me, it's very much a stepping stone into that world if people are interested in exploring psychedelics from a healing perspective. But when I speak to people about psychedelics, because I'm very immersed in that world as well, I always say, our goal is never to keep sitting in the ceremony. There comes a point where we go, am I really integrating what's coming up for me in these experiences to help me just live my life in a happier, more healthy way? Do I need to keep chasing that? And it's the same, but I would say a little less so with breathwork in this form. I would hope that someone doesn't feel the need to continuously chase these experiences, because they can connect us to this deeper sense of peace and stillness within ourselves. There's a wonderful teacher called Zach Bush who says, we've become so obsessed with chasing spiritual experiences that we've forgotten that we are innately spiritual. We've forgotten, we are spiritual beings by default. And so these experiences can serve as a reminder of that, but we have to integrate them. We have to, have ways of making the changes stick. Otherwise we will keep chasing it. I usually see people in first discovering these modalities, wanting to explore them quite frequently. So I'd say, maybe it's once a week, once a month, dropping into these experiences. And then it seems to get less over time. But I would say if people want to engage in it more regularly, once a month, there's just an opportunity just to drop into a really deep connection to yourself, a beautiful experience, an opportunity. If you feel like you're holding a lot of baggage, emotional charge, if there's been a lot going on in your life, it can be a great way just to give yourself a bit of a reset as well. And so, we can use these practices as long as we're using them intentionally, in whatever way we choose. But I would typically say once a month is more than enough for one of these kind of deeper experiences.
A friend of mine who follows your work, she claims she had once an orgasm from this. Is this, that was my reaction, but I tried to be a bit respectful towards her. But is this something that, can it happen?
Yeah. Is the simple answer. It's something that I have witnessed in my spaces. It's something that I've heard from people. I wouldn't say it's ever the reason to explore this work. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say, I don't use it in my marketing. Maybe I should. But yeah, I think, if we want to think about what's really going on there, the beauty of this kind of practice, it can be in the healing process. It can be in the spiritual side of it. It's also an incredibly powerful embodiment practice. So it connects you to the physical form in a way that if we spend a lot of time in our heads, rarely happens. And because we do spend so much time in our heads, we forget how much is going on in our body in terms of sensation, in terms of energy. And so if you start really connecting to your body, there's energy moving in your body. Even if people right now, if I would say to people, just bring your attention, close your eyes and bring your attention into the middle finger on your right hand and try and hold your awareness there, you'll start to feel tingling, you'll start to feel buzzing, you'll start to feel pulsing. Very meditative as an experience, but also quite profound because you're really feeling things. And orgasm and pleasure is both a presence problem if we're struggling with it because we're not connected to our bodies and we're not staying present with the physical experience, but also, it's an embodiment challenge as well. And so actually the more connected we are to our bodies, more energy is moving. It's a very possible outcome of an experience like this.
I feel like if people are going to be trying this at home, I'm sure they're going to go on YouTube, but it can be quite dangerous if they're doing the wrong thing. Where would you advise people to go to? So, for example, you are the founder of the Breath Space. Can you walk me through the Breath Space and also how can people follow your work from home?
For sure. Yeah, it's a really important point. So I always say with that third pillar that we've just been discussing, if you can, I would always encourage people to practice in person with a facilitator first. For your first time or your first few times, and if you have the option, I would always recommend in person with a facilitator. Not just because it's safer, but because it tends to be deeper as well, because you feel more safe, because there is quite literally somebody there to support you through the process. So subconsciously, psychologically, there's a level of safety that allows you to drop deeper. However, I'm also realistic about the fact that breathwork in its nature, in all its forms, is incredibly accessible, and you can do it from wherever you are. You can do it from home. And so there are a lot of good and a lot of bad practices freely available online, on YouTube, on different apps. But again, I would always, with that deeper end of the spectrum, really emphasize easing yourself in and seeking out proper guidance, whether that's, even just finding a facilitator such as myself to ask questions to as to whether it's an appropriate practice for where somebody is in their life. If you have significant past trauma or PTSD, it can be one of the most impactful experiences you'll have, but not something that I would ever recommend you do alone, because it can just bring up so much. And that can be very destabilizing if it's not done in the right way. It can also, and this is one of the challenges we face in the industry right now with all of the growth, people can be re-traumatized as much as they can be healed. Because if you think about this unconscious material surfacing, that can go this way or that way. Yeah. And so that's where we have to be really conscious about understanding what is happening in these experiences. I think there's a real lack of education around really what's happening, but also then taking it seriously and treating it with the respect that a powerful psychosomatic technology and practice and modality can do for us. Like, we have to respect, it's just breathing, quote unquote. But it's so powerful and so potent. And with, it's the old Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And that really applies here as well. So I think that's the first thing that I want to say is, if you do want to explore that deeper end of the spectrum for whatever intention and motivation, go gently, be very intentional and very conscious about how you explore that and who you explore that with. In terms of my work, for those first two pillars, that's where the magic of the digital and the home practice really comes into its own. So the majority of the things on my app are focused around awareness of breath, functional breathing, and nervous system regulation. So we have energizing practices, calming practices, sleep-focused practices. There are also some of those deeper practices for people who are a little bit more advanced, but it's really kind of a process of getting themselves there. In terms of the breath space as a whole, I would say, if your focus is those first two pillars for stress, for general well-being, then the digital side of things is probably the best place to begin.
And everything can be followed through your app, the breath space.
Yes, through the app, through Instagram, through the online channels and the website. And then I would say, if you're wanting to dive deeper, that's where the in-person side really comes in. All of my London workshops, my retreats that I have in the UK and Europe are focused specifically around conscious connected breathing and really diving deep. I have a great team around me for my retreats, where I'll have massage therapists, somatic therapists, traditional talk therapists, just so we can really create the safest possible space for people to have a truly healing experience. So everything kind of through the website, which is thebreathspace.co.uk, and the app, which is the Breath Space.
You also work with corporations.
Yes, I do.
So after your work with corporate workers, what are the tangible benefits that you can see in the workspace? Happier,
healthier people, ultimately. If we think, I think if we get into the mindset here of business and entrepreneurship as well, we're at the cusp of something shifting away from where we've been with hustle culture for a while now, where everything in hustle culture was just push, more, harder, longer. We're now starting to go, fuck, that's not worked. That really hasn't worked. People have gotten places, but then they're burnt out and they're going, I don't feel how I was expecting to feel when I hit that goal, or I reached that milestone, or I sold my company, whatever it might be. We're now starting to see that there's a different way of operating. And what I always say to business owners, to business people who hate the idea of slowing down, they don't want to work with me because they think I'm just going to tell them to do less and to slow down. What I say to them is that my goal isn't to tell you to slow down for the sake of slowing down. It's actually to make you better in the time where you are doing things, rather than, as we spoke about earlier, always being on and operating at 70, 80% output. Be at 100 and then take your foot off the gas, then be at 100 again. Creativity goes through the roof. Productivity goes through the roof when you're more regulated, when you have more balance. And so that for me is really at the core of what we see.
Fascinating. Sorry, one quick question. So being more balanced means, it's interesting because I can see both conversations being accurate. So somebody might say that always being at 70% might mean being balanced, but what you're saying is, in whatever you're doing, do it with intention. And if you're not doing it, you're not doing it, you're doing something else. If you're resting, you're resting. If you're working, you're working.
For sure. That's what I see. I always come back to, I do a small amount of work with elite athletes. And certainly for myself, I always thought these people are just on all the time. They're just going. The people at the top of every game, whether it's athletes, whether it's business, are as focused and as effective in their output as they are in their rest. They take it as seriously. And that's why they're there. And I think that's what the people who want to get there misunderstand. They think it's just about pushing harder, when actually it's about how much are you willing to engage in the restoration and the rest as you are the output and the pushing, because that's where you strike the balance of actually being able to be at your best when it's required, rather than almost anticipating that and being almost there, but not quite there. And I know for me personally, the number one metric for me of regulation and when I feel well rested and in a good place is creativity. For me, that's my measure of it, is can I actually, are there just ideas coming through? Am I connected to my creativity? When I'm stressed, I might be productive, I might be getting stuff done, but it doesn't feel flowy. It feels forced rather than expansive and enjoyable. And so I think when it comes to companies and businesses, it's about that in terms of actually the quality of what you're doing, but in terms of better communication, team communication, team morale, not burning people out. Burnout's probably one of the biggest reasons people will leave jobs now. It's probably one of the biggest reasons that people are unsatisfied in their jobs. It might not even be because of the work. It's just because they are not feeling good. And again, it comes back to the lens through which we view everything. If we're stressed, your work's going to feel heavier, even if one day you enjoyed it. It's going to feel unfulfilling because of your state, not because anything's necessarily changed in the work.
I think the problem lies within how society defines success. When somebody asks you in this day and age, how are you doing? If you say, I am doing very well, and if you don't answer, I'm so busy, I'm under an amount of workload. If you just say I'm doing very well, it sounds like people may perceive, unfortunately, that you're not doing anything, that you're on holiday. You may be at work and you could be absolutely fine with everything. But that's unfortunately something that I've seen a lot. And I think work like yours can help bring some awareness around it and rebalance and recalibrate what matters.
For sure.
And in my opinion, it means exactly what you were saying, doing things with intention. And I think that life, and you can apply this into anything, right? You can apply this into work, you can apply this into your workout routine, you can apply this into your diet. If you do too much one thing, that's going to have negative consequences. One of them will be definitely burnout, but there will be all other additional negative consequences. So I think having a good balance in almost every aspect of your life, it is the best way to live your life, and doing things intentionally. So for example, one of the things that I try to apply in my daily life, since a very close family member passed away not so long ago, is to be present in the moment. And if you are constantly on a work mode, even when you're not working, you're not present. So if you're intentionally forcing yourself to be there, to be in the moment, you are going to be less stressed. I felt that immediately. I think that would also allow you to be more conscious about your breathing. If you're on autopilot, forget about being aware of your breathing. And also, at least in my experience, it unlocks a new definition of happiness, which is being able to appreciate the small things. The fact that perhaps today they're playing my favorite song in a bar, that this morning's coffee tasted, profoundly nice. And, you stop measuring your happiness against these very long-term goals that are very much defined by society. And you stop thinking, once I achieve that, everything will make sense. Once I get that, everything will be enough.
Yeah, it's interesting, one of those lessons that it feels hard for people, myself included. I think it's just the way that we're wired ultimately, but hard for people to learn. How many people have exited their company and, thought it was going to make them happy. And they tell us, these very wealthy people tell us, nothing changed when I became a millionaire. there's a level of, as you mentioned earlier, like a level of financial security and safety that money brings. Let's not deny that. But beyond that, it's not making people any more happy. And that's been known for a very long time. And yet all of the people that aren't there yet still think they'll be the exception to the rule. Yeah, but for me, if I'm a millionaire, then I'll be happy, right? And we're sacrificing the present moment in the chase of that, not feeling fulfilled here and now, and wondering, what's going on? Why don't I feel good? And we're just chasing the wrong thing, an ever-moving goalpost that's just moving away from us every time. We set a goal, we get there, we don't feel fulfilled. We're like, maybe the next goal will get me there, rather than being like, okay, maybe the problem's the goal. Maybe the thing is that I'm externalizing my happiness onto something else rather than just appreciating the small things. And I think that is much easier said than done. I'm very aware of that. I see it in myself all the time. There's still things I want to achieve. There's still ambitions that I have, but can I move towards those things from a place of acceptance of myself, that, where I am right now is good enough, and rather than from a place of lack and trying to prove something. And I think that's a really important shift our society is so geared towards the pursuit of more. Mm-hmm. And it almost feels like pursuing more is a necessary part of eventually realizing that it was never about that. And it was always about what you've got right here, right now, and living a life that is meaningful to you. And that looks different for everybody.
It should look different. And that's the problem. I feel like movies and TV shows define happiness in a very shallow and dopamine-based way, which means I think they make people confuse having fun with happiness.
Yeah.
When they buy that car, that's not happiness. You'll have fun, I'll guarantee you that. Or if you go on that amazing trip, you're going to have fun. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be happy. And nobody shows you in the movie after, they finish the party or they buy the house and they have the car, what happens afterwards. Usually the movie finishes with them smiling and that's it. But nobody shows what happens 7 years after down the line. Like, okay, you still have the house and the car, and how from where are you drawing purpose and happiness and meaning in life? And I think it goes back to appreciating those small things. So myself, I am very grateful for what I was able to achieve alongside with my twin brother in the last 7 or 8 years. We did become, and I'll disclose this, we did become millionaires in our 20s. And it's so interesting because it's true that in the very early stages of our career, we were chasing not necessarily only financial success, but reputational stability. And at some point when you attain those things, and by no means I am not the richest person, but I think from my age, I did put together a considerable amount of wealth. At some point, you realize that the car cannot be fast enough, that the food won't be tastier than that, and that the view of your flat won't be higher. And those things end up meaning very, very little, and you would trade them all for finding real purpose. And to me, finding that real purpose was placing value on the small things in life, because there are so many more of those. And that means that you can really be happy every day. It's like, I've given this analogy in the past. When we're kids, and I'm not sure if you can relate to this, but I can relate myself to this when I was a kid, and also all of my friends. You're 8 or 10 years old in school. This was in Spain back then. We would go through the week hoping that the days would go by so quickly so we could enjoy the weekend. Now, if you do the math, the very simple math, the week has 5 days and the weekend has 2 days. How many days of your life are you wasting, hoping for them to go by just for 2 days? The math ain't mathing. And I feel like we're doing that right now. Our society is doing that at an adult stage. A lot of people are just looking forward or towards a weekend or that holiday, and they are just hoping that their day goes by. Surely they're 9 to 5. And then at some point you realize in your life and you look back and you see how much time you have really wasted. And we forget that our life on this earth is so finite. And unfortunately, we only realize this either when we go through a very traumatic experience, the loss of someone in a very dramatic way, or in a very advanced stage in life. You're in your 60s, on your 70s, and it's not that it's too late. I don't think it's ever too late, but definitely most of your life has already been gone. It's already gone. So if we were to wrap this part of the conversation into one powerful conclusion for anyone to take home, would be appreciate the small things that life can offer you. And through things like, for example, breath work, aim to always get to know yourself better, because then you will be able to make the right decisions that will make you happy, not anyone else happy, not the general definition of happiness, but your personal definition of happiness. Going back to breath work, how do you see this evolving in the wellness space? Do you think this would be better integrated and more mainstream?
Yeah, I think where we're at right now in the world of breathwork is, let's say, the real rise in popularity and the boom of breathwork in the wellness world has been the last 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, more significantly last 5. I feel we have now moved beyond, I suppose, the early majority, which is the people who are already interested in breathwork, already interested in wellness. They're taking care of themselves. They, have disposable income. They're exploring these things. Like, that's for me the early majority. And I think what we're now starting to see is this shift into the legitimate mainstream. So the legitimate middle, where it's, I always take my mom as a good example. Like, if she's interested in something, then we're starting to move into actually beyond just the London kind of city-centric wellness world, which can be a bit of a bubble and an echo chamber at times. And for me, I'm a bit of an advocate at the moment of almost trying to speak of breathwork outside of the wellness world, because I think the wellness world has some pitfalls, because it's become an industry. And when anything becomes an industry, you get commodification, you get over-commodification, you get escapism, you get, if we really think about how an industry works, if they are selling you something, the wellness world perpetuates the belief that people need fixing. And for as long as people need fixing, they will pay for solutions. For me, breathwork is a framework to help people live better lives for the rest of their lives. It's not some endpoint that they'll finally go, oh, I'm fixed, I'm healed. It can support you in so many different ways, just to come to this deeper acceptance of yourself more fully, to navigate life with more ease, more meaning, more balance, more purpose. And so that for me is something that I'm really keen to start talking more about, which is, this isn't about fixing anybody or anything. This is just about, here is a very simple tool that can provide a framework to support you in moving through life and addressing some of the challenges we all face in the modern world in a more effective way, in a more balanced way. If we think about, your point there of appreciating the small things and being more present, the simplest way to tune into the present moment is your next breath. It's the easiest, most effective way to take you into this moment right here, right now. And so I think that's what I'd like to see more of, is removing it from these parameters of the wellness industry. And then something I'm very passionate about in my work is how do we integrate this into the world at large? So whether it's the education system, whether it's public healthcare, really starting to go, as much as I love taking this work into businesses, into, brands, doing all of the work that I do in that space, how do we get it to the people that really need it? Perhaps the people that can't afford it, whatever it is. How do we make this as uniquely as accessible as it deserves to be, and as it naturally is? The breath is freely available for everybody. But how do we really take it to that next level to get it to the spaces where it's needed most?
While you were mentioning this, I was thinking why people go to therapy. And I think there is a distinction in how therapy, for example, is perceived in Europe in comparison to the US. And I think breathwork perhaps could relate to this. If you are in Europe and a friend tells you, I'm going to therapy, you're going to think that your friend has a problem. And I don't think you need to have any problem for you to go to therapy. I think it's a great tool for you to live a better, more meaningful life. If you ask the same question, if you live in the US and a friend tells you that he's going to therapy, you're going to think that this person is privileged. That's probably the main thing you're going to think. He can afford therapy, great for him because it's going to help him or her, which is a completely different perception than in Europe. I very much hope that breathwork also becomes more integrated within our society, because I think if we're all more content with who we are, the whole world in every angle will be a better place. From a business perspective, from a peace point of view, we're just going to be better human beings.
Yeah.
To ourselves, but also to the rest of the world. Jamie, if you had to compress all your knowledge into one essential advice that we must implement in our daily lives, what would it be?
I think the answer to most of our questions and problems that we face today is one of agency and sovereignty and choice. And through everything we discussed, even the point you made around, 9 to 5s and, waiting for the weekend, so many of us are walking around on autopilot, living a life that was never ours to begin with and calling it fate. It's just happening to us. And if you want to take back the reins in your life, which can feel incredibly intimidating and daunting, but if you want to live life on your own terms and not get to the end of your life wishing that things had been different, then the time to start that is now. And one of the ways to start that is by taking back control over your internal state. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through your breath.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I must admit that prior to this episode, I was relatively skeptical about the benefits of breathwork, purely because I'm a logically driven person, and the notion of something being as simple as breathing, having such multi-layered, complete and complex and profound benefits, just seemed something so a bit unreal, like it just came out of a movie. But after going through the research that prepared this episode and then our discussion together, basically all the science behind it, I confirmed that I am a believer, and I will start integrating some of the techniques and practices that you've shared with me into my daily life. I will definitely message you offline to attend one of your retreats with my fiance. But I do thank you for the work you're doing. I do think it can provide so much benefit to the society, and probably my biggest hope would be that your work does get more integrated within our society, mainstream. And maybe perhaps a way to do that is through the education system. And probably, in my opinion, a good way to integrate it in the education system would be to having a discussion with the government. And if that gets subsidized by the government and then implemented, then I just think we're going to be living in a much better world. So thank you.
Thank you.